So what's the deal here with this visit?
Yeah, listen, I think on balance, it's very good news, meaning a big part of diplomacy is simply showing up, engaging in conversations, undertaking that outreach. And so it's very useful for both Singapore and the U.S. to have this kind of regular interchange and have these senior level visits. That's fundamentally good news. Now, how far the visit will go beyond that into substance, will there be cooperation on COVID issues, on climate change, on trade issues, on some of the geopolitical concerns? That's very much an open question. But at least the starting point is a positive one, I would say, that it's always good to have these kind of meetings and visits.
Frank, I think for the last decade, Southeast Asia has been waiting for the U.S. to at least put their rhetoric into action when it comes to putting in time and resources into this region. Do you think this is the time that the U.S. is really going to reassert itself in Southeast Asia?
Well, I'll say this. I think it fits much more with Biden's approach to diplomacy. And Biden, I think, is more from the traditional vein of U.S. Outreach, which is to say the great strength of the U.S. was always leading a consultative process and engaging with friends and allies. And I think Biden comes from that tradition, and Kamala Harris's visit as a partner. So I think we're going to see better attendance at the ASEAN summits, for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN defense meetings. We had Secretary of Defense Austin there for the Shangri-La dialogue. So there's already been a bit of an uptick in activity, and I think that will continue. So I think that's good news, but I also would advise friends in Washington, you better put some cards on the table. You better specifically raise some initiatives that people in Southeast Asia can respond to. Visits and collegiality is a great opener, but it only gets you so far.
Right.
Frank, it's a difficult position, though, for many Southeast Asian countries, is it not? Because they're so dependent on China for trade on the one hand, and they also then have disputes, territorial disputes with Beijing. And the U.S. ultimately has been seen as the sort of guarantor and an ally easier to work with. Do they have to make a choice ultimately?
Riz, I think you put your finger on it. I would tell anybody in Washington, don't try to force a decision because you might not be happy with the outcome. What you need to do is put forward initiatives that allow Southeast Asian countries to warm to you and work more with you, but aren't part of an anti-Chinese coalition. I think the nations of Southeast Asia will be very uncomfortable if what they do is being positioned as hostile to China or adversarial to China, and they don't have an appetite for that. So the requirement is for the United States to articulate some policy initiatives that are win-win, that allow Southeast Asia benefit, allow the United States benefit, but aren't intrinsically hostile or adversarial to China's interests.
Frank, when it comes to this chip shortage that we're seeing globally right now, is there anything that can come out tangible in this trip? What kind of deliverables do you think the U.S. can actually bring? Can we actually see any kind of economic sort of outcomes?
Well, one idea that's been mooted is some kind of digital free trade agreement, meaning it's hard sometimes to liberalize trade on legacy industries because you have vested interests and you have incumbent legacy companies and people are naturally concerned about job dislocation. But it's much easier to liberalize future industries because these jobs don't exist yet or they're growing in all markets. So the more we can liberalize digital trade, digital services and so forth between the nations of Southeast Asia and the United States, I think that's nothing but a win-win. So if there's something going to happen on trade, I think it's going to be in that area.
What other things can possibly be agreed in this part of the world between the U.S. and, indeed, the countries of the region? And I put this in context also because she is vice president. She's not quite the cloud of a Joe Biden. Ultimately, what are you looking for is what would really represent a success ultimately?
Well, Riz, on your point, make no mistake, the first person she sees when she gets back to Washington, D.C. is the president. And he'll say, how was the visit and what do we have to do? So this is a fantastic opportunity for Southeast Asia to improve its connectivity. I would say the second big the second big feasible outcome of this particular visit, besides digital trade agreement, would be something on vaccine distribution. That we see this Delta variant bubbling up. It's plaguing every country in the world. The United States has got production at full tilt. The United States does have surplus. And to come up with the right kind of mechanism to help the countries of Southeast Asia get additional donations, and supplies from the United States would be a very welcome outcome from this visit.
Frank, how does Afghanistan and what we've been seeing there in Kabul here, I mean, the U.S. is dealing with a crisis right now and trying to do a bit of damage control. Do you think that's going to likely overshadow what we've just been discussing, what could come out of this trip?
Well, unfortunately for the visit, it does play into, I would say, the Beijing narrative. Two themes you hear a lot from China is that America is not a reliable partner, so be careful about working things out with the U.S. because U.S. will turn. And secondly, U.S. is in long-term decline anyhow. And so unfortunately, the dramatic events of the last week or so in Kabul play into that narrative. And they do, I think, I wouldn't say cast a shadow, but they do sort of alter perceptions of the visit. But look, I think the wiser people in the region, including the leadership in Singapore and Vietnam, where the vice president's visiting, I think they know full well that the United States is not going to be defined by 1 week in Kabul, regardless of how much turmoil there is there. But the United States relationships are broader and deeper, and the United States is in Southeast Asia since extensively for the last 70 years, contributing, growing, sharing with the nations of the region.